mesdames et messieurs. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another round of the CSPC virtual series. And today, and for the second time during this summer, we have Dr. Rob Annan, President of Genome Canada, with us. But this time, he wants to talk about Genome Canada itself and its achievements. As you know, this year, 2020, is the 20th anniversary of Genome Canada, an institution that established 20 years ago when the genomic research was emerging with big projects such as human genome mapping and big promises. And a few visionary scientists actively lobbied the government of Canada at the time for establishing an institution to lead and support the genomic research in Canada. And that led to the foundation of Genome Canada in the year 2000. We expect to hear more about this from Rob Annan, the President of Genome Canada, in a few minutes. Hello, Rob, and welcome to our program again.
Hi, Merdad. Thanks a lot, and bonjour tout le monde. Hi, everyone. It's great to be back with you today, Merdad. And first, just want to congratulate you and the whole group at CSPC for this really excellent series of interviews and panels you've put together over the last several months. It's been really great.
Thank you very much for that. Rob Annan, just a few lines about him. I kept his resume very short, by the way, for the interest of the time. And Rob, and he's a very well-known figure in science enterprises across the country. He's a biochemist by training from McGill University, well-known in Canadian science and innovation policy circles as well. He served 7 years at Mitacs as Chief Research Officer and Interim Chief Executive Officer. He was a key leader on Mitacs corporate strategy, stakeholder relations, research and evaluations, and policy analysis. Let's welcome Rob to the program. Today's format is that he will speak for a few minutes as introductory remarks, and then I'll ask questions. And at around 12:30 or so, we will open the Q&A box for questions, and I will read questions to Rob, and feel free to put your questions on the Q&A box. And thanks everyone for your participation in this series. And over to you, Rob, for your remarks.
Great, thanks, Merdad. I'll keep these opening remarks short, and I look forward to the questions and certainly engaging with anyone listening in. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here today. Excited to talk about Genome Canada. What I think is a really great Canadian story of science, of innovation, and frankly of science policy. So excited to get into that. It is our 20th anniversary, so I want to look forward to talking about our origins and kind of how we've evolved with the times, but also looking forward now, and what is a pretty, interesting and unique period in history. And what does that mean for an organization like Genome Canada and more broadly to the policy community? Thanks for keeping the resume short. I do want to highlight one thing, so I've been in the role of president and CEO since January at Genome Canada, but my association with the organization goes well back. You referenced my training at McGill in biochemistry, and in fact, the lab where I did my PhD was a recipient of one of the very first Genome Canada grants back 20 years ago. So time flies, first of all, A, but B, it's been fun to come full circle and to kind of come back to the organization from the other side, but also to have sort of witnessed the evolution of the science over those 20 years, because it really is a remarkable story, remarkable evolution. I don't think it's it's a surprise to anyone to recognize that the world, of course, is facing immense challenges. And, right now, obviously, we're in the grips of this COVID pandemic, which poses all sorts of challenges on the health side as well, certainly going forward for, economic recovery and so on. But, there are a number of really important and difficult challenges around climate change, of course, issues around food security, antimicrobial resistance, species at risk, future pandemic outbreaks. So there's any great number of challenges, and I'm daunted by those challenges, but also encouraged and excited about the role that science can play more broadly, but specifically genomics. And as I hope we kind of get into today, I really believe that we're at a spot right now in the life sciences and in genomics particularly, where we will have the ability to make significant progress on these challenges in the years to come. So I'm just totally thrilled, excited about what we've done over 20 years, and equally as excited as what comes next.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rob, for this remarks, and you kept it short. I appreciate that, so that we have more time for questions. So let's start off with this question about genomics as a good starting point for our conversation. Simply, what is genomics, and more broadly, the biotechnology sector?
Right. Yeah. So strictly speaking, genomics is the science of genomes. Genomes are, in a sense, the full complement of DNA inside an organism. So genomics is the study of the structure and function of the DNA inside an organism. But that's a pretty technical definition, and really only hints at kind of the whole scope of genomics. And genomics, that DNA is really the molecular foundation of life. So really growing out of the study of the genome, you get a whole explosion of kind of molecular systems, other molecules, other sort of whole systems, as well as all the biotechnologies that sort of spring from there. So I really think about genomics as basically like molecular systems biology more than anything else.
And the biotechnology sector?
Yeah, so again, the biotech sector largely based on the application manipulation of DNA or DNA-based molecules. And so again, when it comes to genomics, it provides us both the scientific foundation for a lot of biotechnology, but increasingly we're also seeing this as the, kind of almost the raw materials that go into the development of new biotechnologies, whether that's things like CRISPR and gene editing, whether that's synthetic biology and the recreation of whole new circuits within living systems. The genomics really underpins all of that work.
And Rob, I believe genomics has changed a lot in the past decades. And could you refer to some of those significant changes over the course of last 20 years or 30 years?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable to think about the scope of the change, right? So you referenced the Human Genome Project, and you look back 20 years to sequence that single human reference genome took 15 years and well over $1 billion, an international consortium of people. Well, today, you can sequence a human genome in less than 24 hours for $1,000. So just the shift has been enormous. I think about the change. There's a huge number of changes. I'll point to 4 that I think really transformed the sector. The first is obviously that sequencing capability, right? So the ability to sequence DNA rapidly and at low cost means that instead of having a single genome that we work from, the projects we see now involve sequencing hundreds or even thousands of genomes. And what that does, it allows you to do all sorts of comparative work. And instead of having obviously there's a lot of variability in biology, and so this allows us to start to tap into some of that variability, as well as do other sorts of things in terms of rapid turnaround for diagnostics and so on. So the sequencing capability, it's hard to overestimate the impact that change has had. The second big change has been an explosion in what I'd call multi-omics. So genomics, yes, the study of DNA, but from there we've actually exploded into proteomics, lipidomics, glycomics, transcriptomics, metagenomics. So you end up with any number of the kind of molecular systems inside the cell lends itself to the same shall I say, sort of philosophical approach that we see in genomics. And so each one of those opens up a whole universe, but then you can also layer them on top of each other and look at the ways in which these different molecular systems interact. The third big change is really around data. So all of this, of course, creates just enormous amounts of data. So genomics now is on pace to surpass YouTube and Twitter in terms of just data generation. Even a few years ago, we just wouldn't have been able to manage that kind of data. Right. And so today we have the tools, the computing tools, whether that's cloud computing, high-speed internet, and increasingly AI and other kind of big data analysis tools to actually manage all of this data. So it's one thing to create data, but it's another whole challenge to manipulate it, analyze it, make use of it, and now we can do that. And then the last thing I'll say is, you referenced biotechnology, is that the tools that are coming online now are really transformative. CRISPR-based gene editing is still practically brand new. And already we see enormous potential for being able to now work with DNA in a way we couldn't before. That opens up whole vistas in engineering biology, synthetic biology, biomanufacturing. And so you put these four things together, right? Enormous sequencing capability, multiple systems, data analysis and management, and new tools and technologies, and you really do have the ingredients for a real revolution in the life sciences.
Excellent. Thank you for this very comprehensive presentation of the picture of the changes and trends in genomic science. I want to go back to Genome Canada for a moment, and here we are in 2020, and which is the 20th anniversary of Genome Canada. It's a big milestone in the context of COVID-19, even that's more important moment for genomics to show how far it has come and how useful it has been to the human health and fighting diseases. But first, let's talk about the history of the organization. Can you tell us a little bit about the origins of Genome Canada?
Sure, absolutely. So you referenced the Human Genome Project. We'll go back to the 90s, right? And the Human Genome Project was underway. It was a major international effort. Canada wasn't part of that effort, actually. So there was a sense in Canada that we were potentially missing the boat, missing out on this. We had some genomics activity and programs in the country, but we were also losing researchers. And this was during the time of the brain drain. There was real concern. And it was also during a very difficult time for Canadian science as the Chrétien Martin government was really wrestling with the deficit. We were seeing significant cuts. So the 90s were kind of a tough time. But there were a group of Canadian scientists and science leaders who really felt that, who were very forward looking and said, we need to make sure we aren't going to miss the boat entirely on this technology. This is really valuable. And so in 1997, Henry Friesen, who at the time was the president of the Medical Research Council, he convened a genomics working group or task force, genomics task force, and they were really charged with kind of coming up with a recommendation for the government about what Canada should do about genomics. That group recommended that that the government invest in genomics, that this was a strategic priority, that it really was important for Canada to be a player, and that recommendation, along with a lot of work by Henry and a large number of others, in a sense, convinced the government to invest in the creation of Genome Canada in 2000. So this was a very exciting time in Canadian science more broadly, as you would know, and as many of the listeners would know. Right, CFI had just been created, Canada Research Chairs had just been created. We were coming out of deficit, and so there were real investments being made in Canadian science, so kind of new ideas and new energy. I'll say that, what's fascinating to me as I think back to the creation of Genome Canada was how bold it really was. And so this wasn't just to create kind of a program within the government or within the granting councils. A little like CFI, it was, we're going to create a dedicated organization that's going to, have some kind of novel structures, right? So, independent of government, so that it could be, nimble and flexible, but of course closely linked to government in terms of, funding and strategy. Genome Canada was set up with the mandate to build out capacity across the country. And so one of the first things Genome Canada did was to establish genome centers in the region. So there are today 6 genome centers, independent even of Genome Canada, but very tightly linked to what we do strategically as well as operationally. And they're linked really to their provincial governments and their regions. So you ended up with this federated model that was non-governmental, which allowed, in a sense, the alignment of regional strength into a large national strategy. The second thing I think that was really forward-looking in terms of the establishment of Genome Canada was a real focus on interdisciplinarity. So this wasn't just going to be about sequencing genomes and then we're done. This was about building large-scale science projects that would involve those, of course, working on the technology around DNA sequencing and so on, but also working with engineers, with physiologists, with clinicians on these large teams that were really dedicated to addressing specific challenges and specific problems. And built into all of those projects right from the very beginning was a social science element, what we call GELS. And this is a Canadian, there were other versions of this, but in Canada, we created Genomics, and its environmental, ethical, economic, legal, and social implications. So right into our DNA is baked this sense that we're a technology-focused organization, a lot of science, but the social science, the implications of that work are baked right into what we do. The last thing I'll say is just that interdisciplinarity works at the sector level as well. So the Human Genome Project clearly was focused on generating health benefit, right? Understanding, human physiology, human biology, but particularly human disease. Genome Canada is unique internationally in that we had a mandate not simply to focus on the human, but to include sectors including agriculture, natural resources, forestry, fisheries, even energy and mining. And so this multi-sector approach allows for a lot of kind of cross-fertilization from, kind of health innovation into agriculture, things like the microbiome and agriculture informing thinking about forestry. So that cross-sector piece has always been important. So it's a huge credit to, of course, to Henry Friesen, but other, the others that were really involved, people like Bartha Knoppers, Lap Chi, Tsui, Kevin Keel. There's I could list any number of them today, but there's a large number of visionaries who really were forward thinking.
Excellent. That was very fascinating. And I think we should contract out CBC to make a documentary about the foundation of Genome Canada and how it happened, the progress of genomic research in the world and also with a focus in Canada. So can you give us an idea of Genome Canada by numbers? You mentioned, some of the achievements, but in terms of the numbers, the level of investment that has flowed through the organization, how many researchers have you funded? How many products, spin-offs, and they created, and all those things.
Yeah, so a few of the numbers. One, so at high level, just in terms of the scope of the investment, the overall, over the 20 years, Genome Canada projects, we've supported projects to the tune of about $3.9 billion. Of that $3.9 billion, 1.6 or so has come from the federal government, and the rest, 2.3 billion, has been through kind of matching or co-funding of projects by provinces, right. A lot of co-funding by industry and associations, companies, and other not-for-profit groups. So, right into the structure of all of our projects is this sense of cooperation, collaboration. That's true of the researchers. It's also true of the funding. So about 40% or so of our funding comes from the federal government, and the rest is from these other sources. But almost $4 billion over 20 years. That has supported around 500 different projects. A lot of those large scale, big science, focused within these sectors on really targeting specific issues, but also a large number of projects to help build out capacity in things like bioinformatics, technology development. We fund a number of what we call technology platforms. So these are really providing service, expertise, and technology to researchers. So, about 500 projects, 10 platforms. We have supported over 5,000 trainees over the years, which I think is something that, we think about the early days of genomics. No one was a genomicist, right? There was no, so we had to, in a sense, create a whole cohort in the early days and build out that capacity. Those early researchers have gone on to train next generation of researchers and so on. And we're now seeing, within our own programs, those researchers coming back either as academic researchers or working inside companies and looking to build collaborations with academics. So about 5,000 trainees. We've worked with hundreds of companies. Interestingly, we've had about 80 spin-out companies come from our projects. And so these are startups that have come from a variety of different, in a variety of different sectors, often to take the technologies being developed and actually bring them out to market.
Rob, in terms of the contribution to science and scientific research and the trainees, that's invaluable contribution. There is no dollar value for that. That's enormous. But when it comes to startups and companies that you mentioned, is there any way to measure the economic return from those commercial parts of the investment?
Yeah, I mean that's really tricky. I mean, we try, but of course, now we can start to nerd out now on evaluation models because these things are hard, right? When it comes to attribution and so on, and so we don't have a handy number. I think it would be in some ways disingenuous to be able just to point to a specific number, but certainly we're very proud of the work that they've done in terms of growth and building out connections.
That's right. Okay. So now we talked about the past. Let's talk about the future because an anniversary is a great moment to reflect on past success, of course, but it is also important to think about the next 10 years, 5 years, or even 20 years. I want to ask you what kind of impact can Genome Canada and Genomics have or can have in the next decade or even next two, in your opinion?
Yeah. So I think for us, I outlined, the reasons I'm excited about the sector a little earlier, right? I really do think that we are on the cusp of a revolution in the life sciences. And so, and not, I shouldn't even say the cusp, it's happening. It's happening now, and but it's early days. And, for me, what drives me is thinking about how do we, as an organization, support the researchers, support the companies, support the innovators who are going to lead that revolution, right? How do we work with government to help them understand the opportunities, the risks, the challenges? How do we help connect internationally with other initiatives, in terms of, both finding opportunities for our community, but also, making opening markets, opening talent, and so on and so forth. So I think that for me, that kind of coordinating and leadership role is really exciting, but it's about supporting the community and making sure that they have the tools that they're going to need to really drive all of this. To that end, we have 5 or 4, I would say, maybe key priorities. The first is really, I would say, to think deeply and strategically about where genomics can have the biggest impact, and that means working with our community, working with industrial sectors towards a more, I would say, mission-driven approach to making sure that the research that we're supporting is going to have maximum impact, socioeconomic, environmental impact. So thinking really deeply about, where can we actually have a big impact, and making strategic investments in those kinds of areas. The second piece, which is a big focus for us, is around data. Really focusing in on, as I mentioned off the top, genomics is producing enormous amounts of data. And so how do we make sure that that data is being produced in a way that is, secure, that where there's good governance, where Canadians, especially on health data, feel confident that that data is being used for their benefit. But at the same time that we're ensuring that that data is being maximized for economic impact or environmental impact or social impact, really helping in a sense to kind of shape policies around the size of data we're not really used to thinking about. The third piece is around skills and talent, and this is kind of leading into the talking about the trainees we've supported in the past, to make sure that we're thinking always about what skills do the next generation need. How do we make sure that we're fostering a really strong community of researchers and innovators that come out of our programs? And then the last real major focus for us is on issues of equity and diversity and inclusion, and really thinking deeply about inequities that inform our work, that we maybe perpetuate unconsciously. Thinking deeply about how we can make sure that everyone's participating in the genomic enterprise, and that the work we're doing is going to benefit everyone. So for us, those are the key kind of, I would say, maybe priorities looking forward. But all of those is really to help foster an environment where our researchers can thrive and really drive the research in a way that's going to benefit Canada.
Very good. Thank you. And as the last segment of my questions, I want to switch gears a bit to a bigger context that we are in here in terms of science and policy, and government investment in science, and the social contract, so to say, between science and society. The Genome Canada, you mentioned that it was a big investment, and in terms of promise of science. And do you think that is still relevant, what we have learned from this approach by investing in science in Canada?
Yeah, thanks. That's an important question, and one that I think about a lot. We're funded by the federal government, and our projects are funded also by provincial governments. And I never take for granted the fact that Canadians are, spending their tax dollars on the work being done by our researchers. And as such, we have a real responsibility, I think, to think deeply about, delivering value for that investment. As a little sidebar here, and I know that this is the, CSPC, there's a lot of policy nerds, so I don't mind nerding out a little bit here. But, when we think about the current way we fund science, it tracks back to World War II and post-World War II, and particularly to Vannevar Bush, who was the presidential advisor in the US, and his report called The Endless Frontier, which really argued that government should be a patron of science, academic science in particular, because that science, even fundamental science, fundamental research, will generate benefits for society. And so the huge investments we saw during World War II, if you go back pre-wars, governments weren't major investment in science. We had a lot of, kind of science patronage and so on from wealthy individuals and so on. But it's really the wars where we saw these big investments in science. The argument to keep that level of investment high was because we figured, those investments paid off during wartime, they'll pay off during peacetime. And I think that model, that sort of unspoken social contract, really drove, sort of the science enterprise for decades, and we're still working off of that. I worry that that contract is fraying a little bit, and that there's a lot of reasons for that. I see it in signals around, in the public discourse, obviously, questions around kind of vaccine hesitancy, climate change denial. We see it in a lot of anxiety around GMOs and so on. There's this sense that perhaps that science is maybe disconnected from the concerns of people. And we spend a lot of money on science. We could always spend more, of course, but we do spend a lot of money on science through our governments. I think it behooves us on both sides, the society side and the science side, to think deeply about what is the unspoken contract we have here? What are the benefits? That doesn't mean that we need to put dollars in and widgets out, right? I mean, fundamental science is essential, but I don't think we can take for granted that the funding will always be there. I think we need to think deeply about what is the relationship between science and society, and how do we make sure that is strong. And I think, being more open and more permeable around things like open science, citizen science are parts of the answer, but it's a tough question going forward.
Absolutely. So I hope that participants can stop us from this discussion, because Rob and I can talk about this for hours. This is my favorite subject. And the Bush reports that you mentioned, I guess this is 75th anniversary.
Oh, yeah, you're right. It is. That's right.
Okay, so and a little bit, bit of promotion for those of you who may be interested in this topic. There will be a panel, on which Rob will be a panelist as well, at the CSPC 2020 in November at our virtual conference. Please come to the virtual conference.
That almost felt like we had planned that out. That was a good segue there. You're right. We could nerd out on this all day.
That's right. So it's an important topic, but thank you for bringing up this one. And I think I just want to have one last question and then turn it on to the audience. You mentioned about the role of Genome Canada in informing the government, and this is at Science Policy Center, our focus is the connection between the scientific community and also the policymakers at all levels. I just want to ask you, how can your work at Genome Canada help decision makers when making tough choices about science and innovation funding and other matters?
Yeah, good question. I think so this is the CSPC wheelhouse, right, is to talk about science for policy and policy for science. And certainly at Genome Canada, there's a role for both of these, right? And so when we think about policy for science, well, let me start with the other one. Science for policy, we take very seriously our responsibility to make sure that we're helping disseminate the results of our work where they're going to have impact. And certainly government policymakers are a big audience for that, particularly when I think about a lot of the social science work that we do around new and emerging technologies. And that's everything from, concerns around, privacy and governance when it comes to individuals, genomes, but also things like health economics when we think about new technologies being developed and so on. So there's certainly a lot of, I think it's always important for researchers to be able to feed the impact back into decision makers. That's essential. When it comes to policy for science, I think the important thing for anyone working in science policy is to always keep in mind the big picture and kind of the broad objectives, because it's easy, especially in Ottawa, to get caught up in kind of the budget to budget kind of cycle and the challenges of short-term funding crunches or opportunities and so on. And that's just kind of, that's a byproduct of the way the system is. But more importantly for that is, I think, for the science leaders, and I don't just mean people at organizations like me, right across the board. And CSPC does a great job of convening this kind of discussion, which is, what are the objectives we have for science in Canada? And then how can we collectively, not always like by co-authoring a white paper, but collectively through our various conversations, reinforce the role science plays in Canada, the opportunities that we can be tackling, and present something like a coherent vision for science, which allows the government, I think, to have a better and clearer sense of what opportunities they have when they're thinking about how to allocate their own internal resources. So to me, I think it's always important to be having discussions and dialogues like this, and the panel discussions that CSPC always does a good job of convening at the conference. But those allow, I would say, kind of an emerging consensus about where there's opportunities, and that always helps the government.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. That was excellent. Now I want to open up for questions. We have already received, by the way, so many questions, and I'm excited to go through them. Before that, I want to ask my colleagues at CSPC office to launch the first question about the sector that participants would represent. That's always helpful for us to know the audience and accordingly modify our programs so that you like them more. Please, if you don't mind, answer the question, which sector you represent in this session. And so the question is launched, and thank you in advance if you don't mind answering. The first question by Kimberly Gillette. Genomics has advanced our understanding to apply solutions to problems. For example, pharmacogenomics can support the right medicine reaching the right patient. Yet this does not happen, even though it is possible. What will be different now? And how will the genomic be applied, even if people are reluctant to accept it? Very good question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a reminder that science doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? The technology doesn't happen in a vacuum. And this is one of the reasons that we support work in GELS, in their social sciences, because obviously adoption is a big part of the challenge. So when it comes to questions, so for instance, new genetic tests for rare diseases in newborns, the last thing you want to do is develop a test, apply it, and then just like mail the results to parents in an envelope with no support, no guidance, no next steps or anything else. And in the end, you undermine what could be valuable, and you instead create all sorts of new problems. So wrestling with these social challenges is a big problem. And when it comes to health, certainly there are a lot of considerations, which will be familiar to a lot of the people on the call here, right? You have policy issues, you have funding issues. Heck, I still go to the doctor and they have to fax my results over, from the clinic sometimes. So there are system problems that we still have to deal with, and we, as stakeholders within that broader system, contribute in the way we can. But I think that behooves all of us, to contribute to maybe some of the social challenges around the adoption of these technologies, because they're not simply science and technology problems.
Okay, thank you. Question by Case Hubert, which, by the way, liked by 6 people. And you alluded to equity, diversity, inclusion issues and challenges that genomic research might be unconsciously perpetuating. What are those obstacles, and how can we improve?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Casey. So that's a good question. So first of all, in a sense, by definition, the fact that they're unconscious means we're not yet totally aware and sure of them. And so one of the things that we are doing right now is we have established we have an internal working group that's connected to all the genome centers, which is resourced and supported at the highest levels to go through systematically and start asking questions about programs, processes, internal practices, and so on. So the goal is to really work that through. One example, for instance, would be the in genomics research, the underrepresentation, say, of Indigenous peoples, and that's a really that's a big challenge in terms of both, how to address it and how to move forward. We have a project a really fascinating project out of British Columbia called the Silent Genomes Project, which is led by Nadine Caron and Laura Arbour, and they are really looking at ways to work with Indigenous communities in order to gain more representation in the population data sets that will allow for kind of diagnostics and so on, and so that underrepresentation will hopefully not have negative impact when it comes to the application of new technologies and so on. But it involves a lot of work through thinking about consent, thinking about data ownership and governance and so on, and new approaches. And so work like that will inform, no doubt, practice that will spread across a number of other areas as well. But it's an area where the reason it's a major priority for us is because there's a lot of work yet to do on it.
Thank you. Question by Farah Kaiser. How does the format of Genome Canada and the regional genome centers compare to other countries?
Yeah, thanks, Farah. That's really a great question. So Genome Canada really is pretty unique. There are certainly genomics-focused organizations in other countries. But as I said before, they tend to be sector-based, or they tend to be technology-based, right? You have like a sequencing facility, let's say, that exists and is funded somewhat independently. And this idea of an integrated system where you've got both federal and regional is also relatively unique. So this is very much a made in Canada solution. Again, this broad focus on both human and non-human is definitely unique and very interesting. The integration of the technology platforms with the broader set of projects, and then this federated system. Like the federated, it's not totally perfect, right? Every system is going to have their challenges, but like Canada, sometimes the strength is in, recognizing that there isn't a solution that fits everybody. And how do you pull together ideas and initiatives that are going to be able to, leverage strength that you have in, the Maritimes, or where, really great stuff in the prairies, that in the end has been a real strength for us.
Perfect, thank you. A question by Margaret Johnston. Can you give an example or two of a cross-sector success story where an advance in one sector led to changes or discoveries in a different sector?
Well, I think the most obvious advantages have really been where we've been able to, so for instance, when it comes to, let's say, the sequencing platforms, especially in the early days, there was a lot of focus on human sequencing, of course, but those facilities which were set up, so the Genome Sciences facility at UBC in Vancouver, in 2003, they were the first in the world to sequence the SARS genome, right? The original coronavirus, and that was because they had this immense talent, this immense capability that they really leveraged on focusing on that. But in subsequent years, all of that expertise and knowledge was put to use to sequence salmon genomes, conifer genomes, to really, in a sense, bring that really top-end, top-notch technology to these other areas. That combined with, I would say, almost like the soft infrastructure at Genome Canada around, peer review, project management, all of these things, that really was built around, I would say, or at least had a lot of motivation in human health, contributed to building out really big projects in conifer genomics, let's say, or in agriculture. And for those reasons, Canada has really been a global leader. We do well in human health, don't get me wrong. We've got world-class researchers in health. But in those other areas, forestry genomics, we are the best in the world. And a lot of that comes from the fact that a lot of those early successes and technologies were able to be then leveraged into sectors that otherwise might not have had access to that level of expertise and resource.
Excellent. Okay, a question by Eddie Nason. You mentioned the social contract with the public. There seems to be evidence that the public is more supportive of genomics in light of COVID-19. How can Genome Canada take advantage of this support to increase its impact?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it's and Eddie, you're exactly right. I think it's fascinating to see the degree to which science broadly, but especially genomics and genetics, have really come to the fore in this COVID crisis. To open up the New York Times and to see like the whole genome of the COVID-19 virus deconstructed in the New York Times is not normal. So we are, I think, so two things. One, in terms of taking advantage, we are doing our best to communicate the work we're doing through a variety of venues. Part of that is just good public accountability, right? We have a major project called the Canadian COVID Genomics Network that is supporting public health decision makers. We see a real accountability mechanism that we need to make sure that we're communicating about what's going on there, how that works, and so on. I think going forward, it's certainly clear that what we're learning and the systems we're putting in place with COVID will have lasting benefit beyond that when it comes to precision health and other areas. But I think it's also the flip side of this question is not just to take advantage, but to understand the responsibility that we have. And this gets to the social contract question, right? So that right now there is a lot of, I would say, support for science. There's also high expectations for science. And I think that we need to make sure that we act responsibly, right? When it comes to things like over-promising, when it comes to vaccine development. I think that there's a lot of attention on science, a lot of pressure on science, true for genomics as well. And we need to make sure that we are communicating regularly, but also being realistic by being open about the challenges we face, and including the public in our kind of ongoing discovery, so that we build out kind of a longer term relationship rather than trying to take short term advantage and potentially burning some bridges if things don't turn out exactly how we want. So I think it's an exciting time, but one that where we take our responsibility seriously.
Thank you, Rob. I want to ask my colleagues at the CSPC before going to the next question to launch the second question about the region that people are coming from. Again, these surveys is to help us to improve our connections with you and modify accordingly our presentations. So thank you for answering that question. And the next question for Rob is apologies, let me just go there. Okay, so you mentioned by Robert, you mentioned the challenges of attributing quantifiable economic benefits to the investments in Genome Canada. Can you describe a little the quantifiable variables that you do use for explaining the benefits to the investments?
Let me just think for 1 second here.
Sure.
Just jotting down a few of those things. So quantifiable. Okay, so this threatens to get me derailed. I think talking about evaluation, which is an area I find totally fascinating, because of course, as a biochemist by training, I've always been very much about quantifiability, and I want to see the numbers, and numbers don't lie. But over time, I've actually come around to really having a lot of respect for good qualitative research as well. And ultimately, it's going to be a blend of these two. I'm going to get to your question, Robert. I'm not hedging, but both the qualitative and quantitative are really important together, I find. In terms of quantitative, it starts with very basic metrics, right? You're talking here about, co-funding, for instance, right? So, we think about certainly when we talk about, say, to the federal government, we would say that, the co-funding that comes in is a leveraging of any specific investment that's being made, which means that those federal dollars go further. The co-funding, though, also, in a sense, is like a quantifiable endorsement by other partners that this is a valuable piece of work and that we actually believe in this. And whether that's the provincial governments, but often, and even more importantly, industry saying, we're willing to put in, $500,000 into a project like this because this is really important work that we believe in. So, so the co-funding is one way to talk about, the investment benefit of that specific investment. When we think about the kind of the longer term things, we look at things like kind of follow-on investments, follow-on projects that come out of a specific investment. So oftentimes we'll have a major 5-year project that will then spin out a number of other projects, initiatives, and so on, usually involving either the same receptors or new receptors in various partnerships. So that kind of follow-on investment is important. We talk about job creation. So here we can look at we do surveys with our industry partners. So how many of the partners end up creating new jobs that are related to the project that we're working on, both in the immediate term and the longer term? We end up having, we just concluded an independent 5-year evaluation and found that almost 2/3, certainly well over half of our projects that involve industry partners involve students being hired by those industry partners at the conclusion of the project. And so we know, for instance, that they're actually hiring people to carry things on. So we do quantify, say, job creation and so on. But then once you get beyond that, we start struggling a little bit in terms of quantification, and because of course our projects are not working in a vacuum. So if Robert has really good ideas, then he can hit me offline with other metrics.
Excellent, thank you. So speaking of jobs, Samantha Sethi has a question for you, asking how have the jobs in genomics changed during COVID-19 times? I don't know if you can answer because we don't know how it's changed, but do you know, Rob?
Well, certainly during COVID-19 times, I mean, the one thing I'll say is that, I was overwhelmed and just totally amazed at the degree of enthusiasm and commitment from genomics researchers to offer their services, their labs, their expertise to the COVID crisis. It was probably not surprising, but it was phenomenal to see labs that were working on other types of organisms, for instance, saying we have sequencing capacity, we can do extra work if we need it. Let us know, we can get the protocols and we can run samples. We have reagents we can donate, right? So the community response to COVID was really phenomenal. Certainly, anyone working in the kind of the health space, the human health space, or in the virus space has completely been focused on the COVID response. But I think the real challenge has just been in terms of when I think about our own project, the Canadian COVID Genomics Network. It's just been, people have just been working flat out. If you're working as a clinician, if you're working in sample preparation, if you're working in sequencing or analysis, it's just been, both a responsibility and opportunity to contribute. And people have really been going, 24/7, which has been a remarkable thing to see too. So, but in terms of the actual kind of day-to-day and what the lasting impact will be, I think it's too early to tell.
Excellent. So I want to refer to something by Martin Godbout. He is I believe the first CEO of Genome Canada, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's right.
Praise here. It's good to have him with us. Thank you for being with us, Martin. He's saying that Henry Friesen used to say that we don't spend money in science, but we invest money in science. When politicians and civil servants will invest money in science, Canada will improve its economy and the health of all citizens. Rob, do you have any comments about that?
Well, first of all, I'll just say hi to Maltan. Thanks for the comment and tuning in. I'll just, as a corollary, say that I've heard it said that when politicians saw Henry Friesen coming, they used to say, quick, lock up the vaults, because he was so persuasive in making the case for investments in science to the benefit of Canadians. I think Maltan is exactly right. I mean, that it's clear that that money spent is actually money invested. And, I think the Naylor report a couple of years ago made exactly the same arguments, that we can't neglect the investments in fundamental research because the short-term gains in the really applied kind of development end are easier to quantify. You really do need to make sure that you're spending right through the ecosystem, and that those investments at the front end will bear fruit. There's no doubt about that. So I totally endorse Martin's comment.
Thank you. And once again, I want to acknowledge the presence of Martin Godbout as the first CEO of Genome Canada with us today. Thank you for being with us. And we'll look forward to have you as
hey,
well.
That's a great idea.
Someday. Yes, that's right. Thank you. Okay, so the next question is how by Samantha, Samarth Sethi, my apologies if I mispronounce any name. How are the next genomics leaders supported by Genome Canada? Can you tell us of successful startups hiring new people in Canada in the genomics area? I don't think Rob can tell you who is hiring right now, but he can tell you some success stories.
Yeah, so so in terms of next genomics leaders, the main mechanism certainly is through the training opportunities within the large scale projects that we support, right? So, well, through all of the projects we support. So, as anyone on this call or on this in this meeting will know, when we make investments in science, it's not all going to technology. Most of that funding is actually going to support trainees, postdocs, graduate students, and other other what we call HQP. So certainly, investments in science are investing not just in idea generation, technology generation, but they're investments in that next generation who are learning through the participation in these research projects. So that's one major area. The second area is in if you go down kind of even further down the chain, our genome centers are deeply involved in a variety of outreach activities with K-12 students, for instance. So Genome BC has a program called Gene School that does work to kind of bring genomics to students. Genome Quebec just launched a really fascinating project of citizen science with students, where they will do like aquatic biomonitoring of streams around the province in collaboration with the Department of the Environment there. So we have a variety of K-12 areas. We're very proud to support the summer internship program for Indigenous genomics, led by Kim Tallbear out of the University of Alberta, which provides internship opportunities for Indigenous students interested in working in genomics. So there's a variety of areas, and looking forward, one of the things we're grappling with is how to, thinking about it more from the funding side, how do we ensure a balance between supporting, researchers who are later in their careers and researchers who are earlier in their careers, and making sure that we have a good balance across the portfolio, so that that those researchers who are starting out will have the opportunity to certainly lead projects and grow, as well as the established researchers.
Excellent. There's a question by an anonymous attendee, but because it talks about regulatory issue and it's a sort of different, I want to make sure we also touch on that. And it says, even though genomic technology allows us to monitor thousands of genes in patients, the current regulatory environment is difficult because there has to be a rationale for every single measurement. And there are additional problems from physicians receiving too much information, leading to unnecessary treatments. Is there any regulatory work being supported by Genome Canada to explore this problem?
Yeah, thank you. Good question, anonymous attendee. So the short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is I'm not a regulatory expert, and so I start to feel a little out of my depth when I get into the specifics. I will say though, for instance, we support a couple of projects out of the McGill Center for Genomics and Policy, led by Bartha Knoppers, where they're dealing with these kinds of issues, these challenges around regulation and so on. And even within the context of COVID, Bartha was one of the founding board members of Genome Canada, a real world leader in genomics policy, genomics law. And her group is doing phenomenal work on these sorts of issues, and are deeply involved in our COVID work, for instance, when it comes to kind of some of the regulatory elements around data sharing, which is which we don't want to get in the way of the response we're forming now. So yes, the short answer is yeah, we do have a variety of projects that are dealing with this, but I don't want to get too deep into it because my ignorance will start to show itself.
Okay, that's good. And a question by Sharon Roland. How does Genome Canada plan to increase the general public buy-in to genomics solution to maintain funding from government? Many false bias information and negative opinions still exist in general media. That's a good question, actually.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Sharon. And it's, I mean, so this comes to, so there's sort of, since there's kind of two parts to that. So in terms of, maintaining funding for us, my opinion is that we have to make sure that we're doing good work and that we're making sure that that work is known and has an impact. And, that will take care of the funding. The bigger question though is around this public buy-in question and, kind of false information. Excuse me. I'd say, this is an area where, again, there's a real shared responsibility. And, we take our responsibility seriously. We try to ensure that we're available to participate in, media inquiries, in putting out information to journalists, to putting things on the website and social media. But these are, there's a real mega trend now around these kinds of disputes around science and scientific fact. I think it was someone like Tim Caulfield, who is also a Genome Canada researcher and a social scientist, and who does just phenomenal work both on social media, on Netflix, a variety of areas to get out and try to counter these kinds of, this kind of misinformation. It's great to have real stars that do that, and we'll support them. But also, I think all of us have a responsibility to try to do our best to amplify and share good information in this, whatever, in the world where there's lots of fake news, as it were, around science.
Okay, thank you. So before asking the last question and giving Rob the last word, I want to ask my colleagues at CSPC office to launch the last question about our performance in this session. I really appreciate if you could reply to that. Again, your answer will help us to do better in future. And the question asked about the balance of the investment between different sectors. As you mentioned that Genome Canada, invest in different sectors. Given that budgets are always constrained, by the way, I cut off the first part of the question just for the interest of the time. Given the budget constraints, what is the optimal balance for Genome Canada investment between Canada's different sectors?
Yeah, and that's a question without a clear and permanent answer. We're at a stage now in our research portfolio, I guess, where about 50% of our work is in human health, and the other 50% is in other sectors. Excuse me. That feels about right, I guess, right now. But as we're in the process of doing some kind of strategic planning and looking ahead, we're talking to government about its priorities. We're talking to our community of researchers. Going forward, we're constantly fine-tuning and adjusting, and there are a variety of inputs into the decisions on that score. Those inputs include capacity, both existing capacity and where we want to build capacity, opportunity for impact, where there's going to be real opportunities to in a sense demonstrate value, where there's need, in terms of kind of the additional investment, that marginal investment, are an extra dollar in health versus an extra dollar in helping us understand the microbiome as it pertains to soil health. Like how do those things maybe balance out? And the decision making around that involves certainly the Genome Canada, but also our board. We have a science and industry advisory committee made up of international experts working with our government partners and government funders, as well as researchers across the country. So it's always a shifting balance, certainly, and one that we reevaluate pretty constantly.
Okay, so that was it, our session with Rob Annan, the occasion of the 20th anniversary of Genome Canada. And Rob, I want to thank you for your presence here. It was an excellent session. And I just want to remind participants about our next session, which is an interview with Dr. Vivek Goel about the evidence-based policy during the pandemic. And the last word goes to you, Rob. My apologies, that session will take place on Tuesday, the coming Tuesday on the 18th at noon. Rob, last word to you.
Well, first, just I think I'd recommend everyone tune into the conversation with Dr. Goel on Tuesday, because that I'm sure will be super fascinating, and also that everyone tune in when we have a chance during the conference to revisit this question around social contract. It's an area that, like Meredith, I think is really important and really fascinating, and I think everyone, if you're tuning into a conversation like this with CSPC, no doubt you'll have plenty of good ideas to contribute to that. So I think that would be really great. I just want to thank everyone for tuning in. Feel free to reach out, whether that's via social media or otherwise, with any thoughts or questions. I'm always happy to hear from people. I just hope that I just want to reinforce what a special thing we have in Genome Canada. I know, like, I know I'm biased, but being reasonably new into this role, when I look at what's been accomplished, when I look at Maltin was here, and what he was able to create in those first years that then got passed on to the next generation. I take my role here very seriously in terms of carrying on what is a real success story for Canada. I look forward to coming back and doing this again sometime, Meredith. And otherwise, I just want to thank everyone for their time today.
Excellent. Always a pleasure to have you with us, Rob. And thank you very much. Thanks very much, everyone, to attend this session, and look forward to see you and hear from you on Tuesday, the 18th at noon, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Great. Thanks.